Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be starting a brand new series that I'm very excited to do, and that is called Dissecting Gothic Literature. Gothic lit is one of my all-time favorite genres. I'm really passionate about like 1800s, early 1900s, like ghost stories and haunted atmospheric stories. And I was inspired to do this back when I did my Classics That Don't Suck series. I do have another one of those coming soon, but I really wanted to go through and kind of dissect some of my favorite classic works of Gothic literature. These are not reviews. There will be spoilers through this, so I don't necessarily recommend watching these videos if you haven't read the book, but if you are truly passionate about Gothic lit and you have read this book, or you really just want to check out what I have to say, then keep on watching. So it only seemed fitting to me to start the series off by talking about one of my favorite novels of all time, and hands down my favorite Gothic lit novel of all time, The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. I did talk about this book in my 5 Classics That Don't Suck. I will link that video up above, and this is the Barnes & Noble like collectible edition version of The Scarlet Letter. It's so beautiful. I love it. And it says on the back, the Scarlet Letter was her passport into regions where other women dared not tread, which is a quote from Nathaniel Hawthorne. And I just, I love this book so much. And I really just want a reason to talk about how great it is and why I think it is so important in just the classic genre to begin with. So the Scarlet Letter was written in 1850 by Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was not only a contemporary of Edgar Allan Poe, but he was also heavily influenced by Poe's writing. Nathaniel Hawthorne's style is typically considered like dark romantic, both being like the romantic actual style, as well as topics of like romance. So you have romanticism and romance. I pretty much consider him very heavily Gothic. I'd say a lot of his novels are far more subtle than his short stories, but you probably know a lot of his more terrifying short stories, such as Young Goodman Brown, Rappaccini's Daughter, The Birthmark, Ethan Brand, The Minister's Black Veil, and Dr. Heidegger's Experiment. Those are all some of his more famous short stories, and they are very blatant and very scary. A lot deal with like witchcraft and science of like the unknown. So if you've never read those, definitely check those out. They're amazing. Rappaccini's Daughter, I think, is one of the greatest Gothic lit short stories ever written. It's absolutely brilliant. So Nathaniel Hawthorne was born in Salem, I believe in 1804, and he's actually a descendant of John Hathorne. The reason his name is Hawthorne is because he didn't actually want to be associated with Hathorne. So John Hathorne, if you don't know, was one of the infamous judges from the Salem witch trials. He's also the only judge who never repented or showed any regret for his torture and murder of a handful of innocent people during the Salem witch trials. So because Hawthorne was from Salem originally, he didn't want to be associated with his ancestor, who he completely disagreed with. You can actually go and visit his house in Salem, Massachusetts. It is known as the House of Seven Gables, which is another book that Nathaniel also wrote. And it's a beautiful house, very much done in the Salem architecture that it's known for, which is like the old school New England houses done entirely in jet black. It's really cool. I highly recommend it. Being born in Salem, you can definitely see why the opening of the Scarlet Letter is set in Salem in the Customs House, as well as why he really focuses on the hysteria that comes through, I guess, the puritanical panic that defines much of the Scarlet Letter. Nathaniel Hawthorne is probably best known for the Scarlet Letter, which is set in the 1640s, again in a small puritanical town in Massachusetts. And it is the tale of a strong, dignified, beautiful woman and the 2 toxic fuckboys that basically plague her life. So the Scarlet Letter opens up with the famous scene of Hester Prynne on a scaffolding, basically being publicly shamed and giving the Scarlet Letter, which is an A that you would wear on your clothes that stood for adulteress, as a symbol of the fact that she was unfaithful to her husband. She's being publicly shamed with her daughter, who is of course evidence of the fact that she had an affair with someone because her husband had been lost at sea and had not come to the puritanical town to meet up with her. No one knows who the father of this baby is, and she of course is not going to out him out of respect for him, and also from the belief that she thinks he should come out and take blame for something that he is equally to blame for. So the husband in this story is Roger Chillingworth. He is one of my favorite characters in literature to hate. Roger Chillingworth is such a despicable, evil, vile, manipulative, abusive person. He shows up in town just in time to see Hester on the scaffolding being shamed. And of course, at first you would be like, wow, that's probably a large shock for you to come and realize that even though you've been gone for months and months and months and months, maybe your wife assumed that you died and moved on. We don't really know. That isn't entirely touched upon in the book, but if you just read the context of how Chillingworth acts towards both Hester and many of the people around him, he really is a very abusive, manipulative, entitled, evil person. And then on the other side, you have Pearl's father, who is the Reverend Dimmesdale. So a man of the cloth, which would be a big no in puritanical Massachusetts. You cannot be a religious man and be having an affair with a married woman. Dimmesdale to me has always kind of been this spineless hypocrite. He's so concerned with his job and his reputation that he doesn't want to come forward and basically lift the burden from just being on Hester. He, again, preaches about being holy and a good man and living out of sin, and yet behind the curtains is an extremely sinful guy. And through the story, we get to see how these two toxic men kind of plague Hester's life, and how she must not only get through those two men, but also an entire town turning on her, and basically overcome the stigma of now being a single mother in a very judgmental religious town. And she does a great job. She is, by all means, in the book, a very great mother. She is a very charitable and kind woman. She almost becomes beloved by the townfolk who judge her because of all of the good that she does for them and for how she cares for Pearl. Unfortunately, because this is a Gothic story, there has to be something supernatural going on. And most of the supernatural stuff is very subtle. We see a lot of it focus on both Dimmesdale and Pearl. So I'm going to talk about Pearl first, because I always read the book as if she's kind of this like supernatural demon. She knows a little too much. You can't quite figure out how she knows these kind of adult topics that a child shouldn't be able to A, pick up on, or B, have any kind of concern about. But it kind of seems from the very beginning she's 100% aware of what Dimmesdale did, 100% aware that he is her father, and absolutely aware that he is her father through some questionable means. And this is translated basically through Pearl having this kind of open, wild, unruly behavior. We do get to see moments where Dimmesdale tries to redeem himself, but of course it's never quite enough. There's this scene where Hester is imploring, I believe that like head minister, not to take Pearl away from her, that she is capable of caring for her, and Dimmesdale does come out and basically vouch for her and say yes, like she should be able to keep Pearl. So after that scene, we start to see how the guilt is plaguing Dimmesdale. He is slowly being eaten away by the fact that he's harboring this insane secret, and again, in the supernatural light, things are starting to eat away at him, almost in like a physical ailment versus like just actual guilt. And Chillingworth poses as a doctor and ends up becoming Dimmesdale's doctor. Of course, because Chillingworth is a terrible human being, he basically tortures Dimmesdale psychologically, because he's fairly certain that Dimmesdale is the father, but he wants Dimmesdale to admit to his sin. And then of course Dimmesdale doesn't really want to open up to his sin. There's of course this beautiful scene in the book where Dimmesdale gets up on the scaffolding that Hester was basically publicly humiliated on at the very beginning of the book, and basically opens up to this night sky that he is the adulterer as well as Hester. Of course, this is years after Pearl has been born, so it's definitely a little too late. And he does reveal that he has some kind of scarring. It's kind of vague in the book, but I always think of it as this like seared in A on his chest that his guilt is building into him. It's kind of vague whether he's doing it to himself or whether it is something very supernatural that is happening. Of course, I like to always assume it's going to be the supernatural when I'm reading a Gothic lit story. But with Hawthorne's novels, again, like I said, a lot of stuff is very vague. And he does get up there and admit to the night sky, and of course nobody is there to see him except for Hester. Hester does, of course, try and convince Dimmesdale to own up to being Pearl's father, not necessarily to the town that they are in, but just enough for him to leave behind his reputation and escape away with her, and then go out and have a family with her and Pearl. Because deep down at the end of the day, there is still this rooted love for Hester. This is something I've never quite understood with Hester, is how she does still love Dimmesdale, even though he kind of treats her terribly. But I think it's almost more pity for him, because she is able to carve out a place for her in this town, even though she has basically been almost ostracized by the town's people. Whereas the guilt of what Dimmesdale did continuously eats away at him and is deteriorating him. So when Dimmesdale has this idea of, I can escape this and I can go and actually be a father and actually be a husband, he becomes very invigorated, and the next morning he goes up on the scaffolding and gives this crazy sermon and preaching about hellfire and brimstone and clarity and all this crazy stuff, and ends up dying on the scaffolding. It's almost like as he releases everything that was inside of him, because he knows he can escape, he finally just collapses and dies. But he does die in Hester's arms, and it is pretty much shown to the townspeople that yes, this was Pearl's father. It is rumored in the book, it's rumored that night a giant red A appeared in the sky, which would again be a nod back to not only Hester's A, but also Dimmesdale's scarification. And then luckily enough, Chillingworth later just dies, because I guess he's satisfied that Dimmesdale has died, but does end up leaving his entire inheritance to Pearl. And the kind of cute happy ending is that at the very end, Hester takes up her A again. She continues to wear it, lives in her cottage, because she has found happiness in the place that she has carved out for herself. Pearl is set for life, and when she does finally die, she is buried with Dimmesdale under a gravestone with a scarlet letter on it. So two major things that I really, really love about this novel is I love how Hester takes the scarlet letter A, instead of having it mean adulteress to her, she makes it mean able, A-B-L-E, because she wants to prove to herself that she is able to get through her hardship. She is able to be the single mother. She is able to find a place for herself in this town and be who she wants to be. She's able to escape Chillingworth. She's able to move on from Dimmesdale, more or less, and able to do the things that she needs to do. And she becomes this symbol to the town of somebody who can still succeed even beyond their sins, and shouldn't necessarily always be defined by their sins. And I've always loved that. And then you get beyond that the kind of almost Edgar Allan Poe style mental guilt trip, I guess might be the right word. Whenever I read Dimmesdale's story about scarification and kind of screaming into the night sky about his guilt, it always makes me think of The Telltale Heart, and how the protagonist in that actually was able to get away with a murder, but the guilt drove him to insanity, which drove him to admit to it. And I see a lot of parallels there, and the kind of mental corruption that guilt can have on our characters. So we see that both with Dimmesdale as well as Chillingworth. We don't really see Chillingworth before he gets to this town where Hester and Dimmesdale live, but you can see that he's also kind of being mentally corrupted, I guess, by his own jealousy, and then of course almost like the guilt of him torturing Dimmesdale. I would say it does drive him to be more and more evil, more and more sinister, and at the end of the day it also leads to his death, though it's nowhere near as prominently displayed as Dimmesdale's. And I've just always really loved that kind of balance between the two, of these two toxic men do in the end get what they deserve, and this woman who was abused and used by both of them is able to come out on top. And the fact that a man wrote this in the 1850s, I think to be just mind-bogglingly progressive and so feminist. And it's such a beautiful book, and it's definitely one of those books that like you have to sit and take time to read it. It's a little dense. The language isn't always the quickest. Again, many things that happen in it are extremely subtle. So you really just have to sit and take the time and dissect what is happening. But I do love that even though it is a book from the 1850s set in the 1640s, it is still so modern in its themes and concepts, especially when it comes to the treatment of women and the way women are seen in society. And I think it's a beautiful book, and I think absolutely everybody should take the chance to read it. Hester Prynne has always been one of my all-time favorite characters. My YouTube name is inspired by Hester Prynne. Obviously, I've always thought of her as like one of the heroines in novels I want to look up to, and I think she does an amazing, amazing job. And this is something that you don't see too often in Hawthorne's writing as forcefully as this one does. There is a lot of corruption and a lot of criticism on how like the outside, on how society perceives certain people, but this is the one that really drives home that kind of feminist concept, and I really love that. Again, not something I feel like we see that much in literature written by men, especially in literature from like the 1850s written by men. So definitely want to check out. Again, if you've read this book, which hopefully I didn't spoil like a billion things for you because you watched this and haven't seen it, but if you've read this book, I hope that you get as much out of this novel as I do. I think it's beautiful, and I do think that it is so eerie and supernatural in such a slow burn, atmospheric kind of way. I find Pearl a really interesting character. I find her both terrifying and compelling at the same time. She's also the story of like the corruption of an innocent child. And I think some of her like almost like demonic tendencies that we see from her, and her like her insane knowledge that she shouldn't have, really is a metaphor for like the things that children have to go through when you do have that father who walks out on you. And she does have to grow up faster than she should because of it. She does have to learn to be more independent because of it. She doesn't always have that to lean back upon. You see her kind of as like an outcast as well, only because of the circumstances she was born into. And at the end of the day, she is able to succeed, and she does get what she deserves, which is a lot of stuff that she was missing in life, you know. She does get to become the benefactor of Chillingworth, which is, I think, a very nice ending for her. It's implied that she just went on and had a very happy and successful life. And I've always loved that she has a happy ending, as does Hester Prynne, because they had to go through so much because of something that really, in today's world, wouldn't have been their faults. So yes, I think this is one of the best novels ever written. I think it's a timeless classic. I think it has so many amazing messages in it. I feel like it's so contemporary, it's so relevant today, and it is definitely a must-read that everybody should put on their TBR if they've never read it, or definitely reread it. I mean, I've read this book so many times, I've lost count. I own so many copies of this book. I'm just obsessed with it. Definitely the first book that got me into like feminism in literature. Definitely one of the first books that like opened my eyes to the fact that like, yeah, sometimes men get away with stuff that they shouldn't, and they treat women pretty badly, and that is a problem that needs to be spoken about. Of course, that doesn't mean all men, but it does happen. And it's something that we should be aware about, and I'm so happy I read this book when I was like 15 and really got that message out there. So yeah, that is all that I have for you guys today. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, I post every Monday and Thursday. And if you have any classics that you are obsessed with, as much as I am obsessed with the Scarlet Letter, please drop those in the comments down below. I would love to see what your favorite classic Gothic lit stories are. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you all in the next one. Mwah! Bye.